Welcome to the Friends of the Earth System Change seminar series. This aims to facilitate learners to connect the dots between global justice issues, draw out the root causes of injustice, and reflect on action pathways, while also amplifying the work being done by groups locally and around the world. Today, we're focusing on climate change and racism with Mehmet Uluga. Mehmet is a migrant from Turkey living in Ireland and is the national organiser of United Against Racism, as well as a committed climate activist. Mehmet's particular interest is in linking the struggles against racism with the campaigns to stop climate change, which are interlinked in our fight for system change. So now I'll pass over to Mehmet for a presentation about these connections. Thanks very much for joining us, Mehmet.
Thank you, Evelyn, and good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here to talk about this topic, and I'm really delighted to be able to connect with you all this evening. I think it's a very interesting and rather difficult topic to talk about climate justice and system change, not climate change, and link it with the struggle against racism and international solidarity. It's difficult in a sense that it's not always easy to simply chant a few slogans about international solidarity and climate justice or solidarity with the global south and just leave it at that. One has to really back up what we mean with all of that, and one has to, I think, give it a bit more substance if possible. Before I start, we are facing another refugee crisis in Europe with the brutal attack on Ukraine by the Russian army. And yet again, we have seen thousands of civilian, ordinary people who have to pick up whatever they can and just flee their homes to find safety and security for themselves and families. So the refugee crisis has been not just one that sort of happened somewhere far away from Europe and people from faraway places have been coming to Europe, but it is now happening also right at the European borders, in fact, within the European continent. And I think we have to start with extending our solidarity and support to Ukrainian refugees. And I personally like to condemn and reject Russian aggression against the Ukrainian people, whatever their arguments and reasons are. I believe it's based on lies and Russian aggression. But that's probably a different conversation anyway. But we need to start with Ukrainian refugees, I think. But as we see so with Ukrainian refugees, and as the human tragedy and the trauma and the sort of the crisis emerged within a couple of weeks, really, and reached its peak at this stage, we have to also remember it's nothing new in Europe. Going back to this First World War, Second World War, indeed, thereafter wars in Bosnia, the refugee crisis has been a reality of the world, and in fact, a reality of the European continent. Basically, and most significantly, I think the last 2 decades, since 2001 and then 2011, the Arab Spring revolts have been key moments of global refugee crisis. In 2001, we had 30 million global displaced people. Many of them are refugees. Some of them are internally, but many of them are also externally displaced. And the UN had said at that time, unless nations come together, unless the human rights-centric approach is taken, and unless the wars that actually are the real cause of refugee crises are stopped, ended, there will be more and many more refugees. And I don't think anyone had thought by 2011-12, the number will double to become 60 million. And today, only 10 years afterwards, we are talking about the global numbers of 85 million people and increasing. Many of these refugees were the refugees of the war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, some of the military intervention and brutal military dictatorships and very oppressive regimes in Africa and Asia, and many of the refugees have emerged from those crises. The Afghanistan war, the Iraq war has created millions upon millions refugees. Many of them have been externally displaced. Then came the war in Syria and in Sudan, in Yemen, and those wars and those conflicts have added to the millions globally, and we are facing this crisis today that we are facing. But there was something very interesting and very different to what we see on the mainstream media today, to what we hear from government ministers in Ireland, I'm talking about, indeed in some other European countries as well, and what we also hear from sort of policymakers at the European level. We talk about open borders today for the Ukrainian refugees. We talk about creating child-friendly facilities. We are talking about welcoming refugees and their pets. We are talking about giving them right to work, social protection. We are talking about giving them proper education facilities in their own language. We are talking about all sorts of good things. And all of these things were the things that we have been saying, shouting on the streets, writing on our slogans and on our placards and banners for almost a decade. And during that very same decade, the government had said it is not possible to house people in individual homes. It is not possible to give people own-door accommodation. It is not possible for asylum seekers in Ireland to have a driver's license, never mind opening a bank account. And it was somehow not possible to find language-focused educational facilities. And it seems the Irish government has somewhat come to terms with all of that and agrees now with everything we have been saying for almost a decade. But that's also hypocrisy. It's good, absolutely good, and the more has to be done for Ukrainian refugees, but it is also an exposure of an absolute hypocrisy that has been going on for almost 2 decades, if not one anyway. So we have to be very real about these hypocrisies, and we have to really not distinguish between one victim of one war versus the other victim of another war. So we have to be able to say all refugees are welcome to Europe. We have also seen something else with the European Union. And the reason I want to link it to the European Union is because the European Union is a major, major player, both in terms of climate change, and also wars and support to wars, etc. So the European Union set out to organize summit after summit. European foreign ministers, European defense ministers, European leaders have been meeting summit after summit. And their first and most important topic was, how can we make sure we take the least amount of refugees during the longest possible period? You will remember the European refugee program that started in 2014-15. 120,000 refugees were to be relocated into European states. And only half of these refugees have so far been relocated, have been given safety, protection. The rest are still millions of them. And refugee camps in Libya, in the Middle East, in Lebanon, Turkey, whatnot, in Iraq, even in Egypt, etc. And the European Union has taken the approach of persecuting human rights activists. Sean Binder, for example, a young man, born, I think half of his family is from Kerry and from Germany. He's an NGO worker. He's a human rights activist. Has been put on trial in Greece for charged with 25 years in imprisonment if he's convicted, and he's been charged with human trafficking because he has been saving drowning refugees off the shores of Greek island Lesbos. You will remember the German ship captains or the Italian ship captains who were out in the sea in the absence of any state actually fulfilling that humanitarian responsibility, rescuing people. And they have been put on trial. Many of them weren't actually eventually charged with anything, but their lives have been turned into horrible miseries, really. The European Union decided very proactively to scale down search and rescue operation, and 39,000 refugees have died at the European borders. Officially, the European borders are the most deadly, most dangerous borders anywhere in the world. 39,000 people have died at the European borders. Only 3 months ago, at the Belarus-Polish border, you will remember the refugees freezing to death at the height of the winter. And you will remember the European Union response, only militarizing further the borders and actually talking about European security and European concerns rather than addressing the refugees. Today we are seeing somewhat a different European Union. Today we are seeing somewhat a different Irish government. It's good that that change has materialized really, but it also is an exposure of hypocrisy. Why European Union? While European Union has been talking about militarizing its borders, making sure the Fortress Europe policies are in action, it has been also a block that, number one, has failed, utterly failed to take any reasonable, meaningful, radical action to stop the climate change. And it's also a bloc that has been part of the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and interventions in Libya, for example. And some of the European Union states who are members of NATO have been not just supporters of the war efforts, they've been active players in all of these wars. So European Union is not just a place where refugees are seeking safety, should be allowed in to have safety. European Union and European Union states are also active supporters of the crises that actually cause millions of people to become refugees. Therefore, European Union is not just an authority of decency or human rights, or cannot necessarily lecture anyone else on all these good things. The same European Union has been actually part of polluting, and horribly so, with uranium and plutonium and whatnot, the Iraqi landscape and Afghani landscape. Millions of gallons of waters in Iraq, for example, are polluted beyond any civilian use. The childbirth, death at childbirth, has been significantly increased. Children are born with cancer in Iraq for almost a decade, almost more than a decade. Women have been diagnosed with all sorts of very deadly diseases because of the pollution of the soil, because of the pollution of the earth, and whatnot. So war is not just something that kills people instantly by an explosion. It also creates further miseries for generations of people to come. And that is part of the militarization, that is part of the imperialist agenda that actually pollutes the earth, pollutes the air, pollutes the water, and actually does nothing, absolutely nothing when it comes to meaningful action to make sure our future generations and our lives are safe. So European Union, therefore, and big states, mega economies are responsible of climate change, have also been responsible for the causes of refugee crises. Therefore, we have to not only put pressure on them to do the decent thing, to accept refugees and give them safety and security, we have to also put pressure on our governments in order to stop climate change and in order actually for them to stop this horrible race, arms race, and horrible militarization that's happening as we speak in many places. There are at the moment 12 active conflicts in the world, not just Ukraine, 12 active conflicts and 84 million displaced people. The UN had issued a report only 3 years ago, and that report was published in the Financial Times. And that report was specifically about the climate refugees. Unlike the refugees of war, refugees of oppression, climate refugees do not have a legal definition. There is no basis such as climate change and relevant and related disasters based on which one can seek refuge. There is no legal framework. There is no definition whatsoever. And the UN report was saying already 300,000 families in some of the Asian countries have been displaced either within their own country or to neighboring countries because they couldn't farm anymore, they couldn't sustain their lives anymore, and they won't be able to actually return to their homes. So 300,000 families, it was in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in some of the African countries, had already been displaced. So that's 300,000, and multiply by on average 4, that's 1 million people already. Unspoken refugees, refugees of climate change. And at the same time, US generals and European Union leaders had been talking about climate change and climate refugees. One US general advising the Trump government had said, and I quote, "If you think that the Syrian refugees are refugee crises, the millions displaced, you haven't seen refugee crisis wait for the climate change to take effect. Climate change is real and it's going to displace many, many more millions of people." And in Financial Times, the analysis and the conclusion was, as suggested by the US general advising the White House, we need to work, he said, with our European counterparts and make sure our border defense systems and our border militaries are such that our continents, North America and European continents, are protected against the influx of people. So here we are, a US general advising the president, openly acknowledged and admits that climate change is real. It's going to create millions of climate refugees. But the response to this is not stopping climate change, is not helping people where they are. It's actually border militarization, border fortress Europe style policies, and actually making sure that people are not allowed into our countries. But here's the problem. They may stop people, but borders don't stop climate change. Very soon, the Irish fishermen may find themselves in a situation where they can't fish anymore, or the Irish farmers, or the Irish workers. We may find ourselves more flooding, more droughts, more uncertain weather events may actually cause a lot of miseries for the European people themselves. So Europe is not necessarily protected against climate change. And when you look around, the very same people who actually argue for militarization and argue against real action against climate change can also lecture us on how to protect ourselves against the people coming to our border. It's not a situation where our borders and inside our borders are civilians who deserve a good life, and outside of the borders are the barbarians. I think the real barbarians in this case are those who are actually implementing border policies and those who actually willingly and knowingly will not do anything against the climate change. So there comes the link between, in a sense, international solidarity, anti-racism, and climate change. When we say system change, not climate change, we're actually talking about the very same system that these people, on one hand, have their wars, have their militarization, have their racism, border racism, and also the climate change. Many of these governments, including the White House, the European states, are really ignoring the realities of the climate change. And when it comes to refugees, they are actually not interested in human decency, human dignity, and they're not interested in human rights. The Geneva Convention of 1951 and 56 have been thrown out basically. It doesn't operate anymore. It doesn't work anymore. The signatories to the Geneva Convention are not following the rules and the policies of that convention. And what we have seen throughout is racist policies at European borders directly enacted by European governments. So I think that's the link. And I like to say international solidarity, solidarity with the global south, solidarity with the people who are affected by climate change or wars actually starts at home. And I'm delighted, for example, when we had the Rebellion Week organized by Extinction Rebellion, Friends of the Earth were part of it. And when we have anytime, anywhere, a discussion on climate change, and when we talk about the ordinary decent people and their rights, there's always been an angle that talks about the refugees, talks about anti-racism in terms of refugee solidarity, and talks about international solidarity. But I think that solidarity starts at home in terms of us putting pressure on our own governments, wherever we are, and actually making sure that our governments are not part of these brutal policies enacted by the European Union and other powerful states of the world. I think that is the key. I mean, it's always important to be in solidarity with the farmers of India. It's always important to be in solidarity with the workers of Qatar or workers of our people of Afghanistan and Iraq. But it is very important that we have to make sure that our government doesn't fly out to Saudi Arabia or Qatar and does horrible beef deals in order to support and further enrich the beef barons of Ireland, and meanwhile tells us trade missions are not places to talk about human rights. Actually, trade missions are places where we talk about human rights. Richard Bruton of Fine Gael had said that when he was visiting Saudi Arabia, when people asked about human rights in Saudi Arabia, he said trade missions are not a place to talk about human rights. So we have to cleanse our trade in a way that it is climate friendly, it is not racist, it doesn't support brutal regimes, it is not feeding into the armament of the world, it is not feeding the warlords of the world. All trade cannot be allowed to continue in a way that as if everything is fine and we need to grow more beef and we need to sell more beef. No, that has nothing to do for the well-being of the people of Ireland. Indeed, it has nothing to do for the well-being of people in Saudi Arabia or Qatar. Therefore, I say the struggle starts at home with our own governments, with our own ruling classes, because when we say we want to change the system, or solidarity in Saudi Arabia may not necessarily be able to do that, may not necessarily have a practical consequence of that, but system change has to start with a struggle at home, because when we achieve victories in our place, in our country, it will be a signal, it will be a sign, it will be a hope to other places, other people in other places. And I think it's very, very important that that angle is taken on board, that we don't actually fall into the trap of motion passing or sentiments of goodwill, but the world continues on as if nothing has changed. So system change, not climate change, has to start from home. And the very same people who run this system, despite all the warnings, the very same people who allow refugees to die, despite all the evidence that people are not coming to Europe because Europe gives them free houses or there's hugely generous social welfare, whatnot, will have to be warned, quite radically so. And we have to keep the pressure on our governments and our ruling classes. And climate change is indeed, I will conclude with that, Evelyn, is going to create many, many more millions of refugees. Last year, the country I'm dialing in today, I'm from Turkey originally, Eastern Turkey, saw 54 degrees. 54 degrees. No farmland was left untouched. People couldn't work. The children died. The young children, babies died because of heat wave, and millions of tons of farm produce was wasted because of the heat, excessive heat, unheard of in the last century. This is climate change. And today we are talking about thousands of farming families in Turkey, in other parts of the Middle East and Asia, not being able to farm anymore. And these people will become cheap labor. If they're lucky, if they are very unlucky, they will become refugees. And the response of the very same system that actually caused that refugee crisis will be closed borders, Frontex policies, Fortress Europe. So that's what I understand from system change, not climate change, and interlinking it with anti-racism struggle. Because the world for refugees and ordinary decent people of Europe is one that actually fights against racism and indeed stops climate change. Otherwise, I think we are facing a barbaric world that none of us want to bring our children into, none of us want to live in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mehmet. And if anyone's looking in the chat there, you'll see the link for joining, supporting and following United Against Racism. So for those upcoming actions and protests, you can keep an eye on their social media, their website, or join those monthly meetings. Thanks so much for joining, Mehmet, and thank you everyone for joining here and asking questions.